I'm joined here by Professor David Engelsma from the States. We're in the Oak Room at Gartmore House in Scotland. I wish to discuss with him his work, Christ's Spiritual Kingdom, a Defense of Reformed Amillennialism. Professor Engelsma, how did this book come to be? What was the occasion for this little work?
The occasion for the book was a fierce attack on what I had written in a Reform magazine in the United States called The Standard Bearer. I was editor of that magazine at the time and wrote what I thought was an innocuous editorial around the first of the year concerning the second coming of Jesus Christ, and that this was the hope of the believing child of God. Whereupon there fell upon me an assault by some of the leading lights of the postmillennial movement that calls itself Christian Reconstruction. Gary North, Gary DeMar, and after a while, yet another leader in that movement, whose name escapes me right now, sent in letters to the magazine, or wrote in their own magazine, articles that were sharply critical of traditional Reformed amillennialism, which I had been defending and propounding in the Standard Bearer. I responded publicly to these men and then became convinced that it was worthwhile for the readers of the Standard Bearer and for others who evidently were reading the magazine that I would briefly set forth the truth of Scripture concerning the last things, or what is referred to as Reformed amillennialism. And the result of those editorials, a series of editorials, was the publication of this book, which contains not only my writings propounding and defending the amillennial doctrine of the last things, but also the exchanges I had with Gary North and Gary DeMar and the other Christian Reconstructionists.
Okay, maybe Andrew Sandlin?
Andrew Sandlin was the third man who mixed it up in that debate.
One of the letters in here mentions lawyers.
Yes. In the book I make a passing reference to a lawyer from Idaho who, in the course of my writing these editorials criticizing postmillennialism in general and Christian Reconstructionism in particular, threatened me with legal action if I continued to expose and condemn postmillennialism. And I recall that I made, in my response to his threat, which was intended to stop up my pen, that although Christian Reconstruction is notorious for its willingness and capability to hand out sharp criticism, it has a very thin skin when it comes to receiving criticism.
There's also talk in here, it's a few years ago though now, of a sort of threat, I guess, of a debate. After
I had written the opening editorials expressing the Christian hope of the soon coming of Jesus Christ and criticizing postmillennialism for putting the second coming of Christ off at least 1,000 years, and according to some of the leading postmillennialists, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, I've received a request from Gary DeMar, who is a leading postmillennialist and Christian Reconstructionist, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, that he would come up to Grand Rapids, Michigan at his own expense and debate the issue with me. And my response was that I was open to that because that would give me an opportunity to defend amillennialism before a crowd. He would possibly draw a crowd. But as I recall, I also suggested that it would be better that I would come to Atlanta, Georgia, and debate him in front of his crowd. Maybe I made that a condition. I'll debate you in Grand Rapids if you will set up a venue in Atlanta, Georgia, so that I can come to your territory and set forth the Reformed amillennial position there. And he politely declined that condition, so the debate never came off.
Well, in this book, the cover shows a trumpet or more than trumpets. I take that to be a reference to the trumpet of the Lord sounding at the last day, when Christ comes through the clouds to raise the dead, bring us to the judgment. The inclusion of the trumpet, was that also intended to be a trumpet call to battle on this issue? Do you recall?
As I recall, the book, Christ's Spiritual Kingdom, was not published by the main publishing agency in the Protestant Reformed churches, but by an evangelism committee of the Redlands Protestant Reformed Church in Redlands, California. They thought that this exchange with the Christian Reconstructionists and the positive setting forth of the hope of the Reformed Christian, according to the Reformed Confessions, was worthy of publication in a volume. And I believe that they had a man in their congregation, Timden Hartog, if I'm not mistaken, who designed the cover. He never explained to me what the cover symbolized, but my understanding is that it's twofold. As you said, the trumpets on the cover indicate the nearness of the coming of Christ, but also reveal the book to be a trumpet blast on behalf of amillennialism. I recall that when I was beginning the series in the Standard Bearer that later became the content of this book, I noted that although in North America anyway, dispensational premillennialism is advocated widely and on every hand, and although the postmillennial movement is becoming more prominent and more vocal, there is in the Reformed Presbyterian community very little written in strong defense of the Reformed amillennial position. Here and there are some writings that set forth mildly the essentials of the Reformed amillennial position, but there's no hard-hitting defense of amillennialism. And that's what this book is intended to be.
So I suppose one such toot of the trumpet was calling the post-millennial Christian Reconstructionist movement a proponent of Jewish dreams.
That description of Christian Reconstruction post-millennialism, which I charged in the book, especially drew the ire of the Christian Reconstructionists. All three of them reacted angrily against that description of their position. And I think that phrase, more than anything else, occasioned their public response to the book, either in their own publications or in letters to the Standard Bearer at that time. But what they ignored in their objection is that that phrase is taken verbatim from the Second Helvetic Confession of 1566, in which confession, which was universally accepted by the Reformed churches in that time, described the very view of the postmillennialists as Jewish dreams, by virtue of the fact that the Jews have always been hoping for an earthly kingdom in which they will have earthly dominion and enjoy earthly prosperity. And that, I charge, is exactly the hope of the postmillennialists. As I recall, I mentioned in the book that although the postmillennialists will acknowledge a second coming of Jesus Christ and the end of human history and the end of this present creation, and therefore think they escape the sin of preterism, that's another topic that comes up in the book. The fact is that it's evident in the writing of all these postmillennialists that the second coming of Jesus Christ does not at all have the heart of the Christian reconstructionists. Whereas the Christian church has its heart set on the parting of the clouds and the appearing of Jesus Christ in the body, and what we will have and what we will become and what we will enjoy at the second coming of Christ. What has the heart of the Christian Reconstruction postmillennialists is their millennial kingdom, over which Jesus will not be ruling visibly and bodily, but the saints will be doing the ruling on his behalf. And then to add further to their diminution of the lordship of Jesus Christ, after the millennial kingdom is over, that's the end of the kingdom of Christ. The kingdom of Christ is exhaustively and exclusively the 1,000 years or the 100,000 years of this temporal, carnal dominion by the saints. So Jesus never really himself personally shares in the glory of his own kingdom. If he has any glory in that kingdom, it's by virtue of his people.
Well, you mentioned preterism in that last answer. How do you explain preterism?
Preterism, full-blown, unqualified, consistent preterism, is a gross heresy, an anti-Christian gross heresy that utterly abolishes and destroys the Christian hope and the hope of the Church of Jesus Christ. The hope of the Church of Jesus Christ has always been and is today and will be, as far as the true church is concerned, until the end of the ages, the bodily, visible second coming of Jesus Christ, at which time, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, he will destroy personally the man of sin, whom he will confront face to face, and raise the dead, conduct the final judgment, and usher in the perfected form of his kingdom. Preterism, full-blown, consistent preterism, and I emphasize the word consistent because there are inconsistent preterists also, and that's really the subject of what I'm saying now. But consistent preterism teaches that Christ has come already in the only sense in which the New Testament prophesies his second coming. And that's supposed to have taken place in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the opening up of possibilities for the expansion of the Christian church. Everything that the Christian church has hitherto taught will take place at the second coming of Christ is also in the past. That's where the word preterism comes from that describes this heresy. Preterism is a Latin term that means past, basically. So, however they explain these things, and it's not my calling to try to explain these inexplicable things on their theory, however they explain these things, preterism teaches that the dead were raised then, the judgment was conducted then, and eternity was ushered in AD 70. It's all in the past. Antichrist is past, the resurrection is past, the Great Tribulation is past. Everything that the the church has hoped for is in the past. And apparently, the church and the world just go on as they're going on today forever and ever and ever until the sun loses its heat and everything perishes in the cold. That's preterism. I accused, and still do accuse, despite the threats to take me to court for the accusation, I accuse Christian Reconstruction, postmillennialism, of being strongly tainted by the preterist heresy. I don't charge, and I know better than to do that because they can prove otherwise from their writings that they want to go all the way with preterism. They still do acknowledge that there will be a second bodily coming of Christ, maybe 100,000 years from now, and a resurrection of the body and the conducting of a final judgment. But they are guilty of thrusting many of the events that the New Testament predicts and prophesies for the future into the past. And especially does that refer to the Antichrist. All the New Testament prophecies about the Antichrist were somehow fulfilled in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And in a very real and important sense, and that's the main thing, the postmillennialists of the Christian Reconstruction type especially, but other postmillennialists too, maintain that many of the New Testament prophecies of the coming of Jesus Christ happened in AD 70. Some of the most outstanding passages in the Bible concerning the coming of Christ, the end of Philippians 3 and the first part of Philippians 4, and other passages, they maintain took place in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And the whole almost of Matthew 24 must be understood as having been fulfilled. That basic eschatological chapter, Jesus' own teaching of the truth of the end, almost all of that chapter, they differ among themselves as to where the dividing line is between what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future, but virtually all of Matthew 24 took place in AD 70. And that way, of course, they get rid of the prophecy of the Antichrist, of the establishment of the anti-Christian world kingdom, and of the Great Tribulation. All of those things are contrary to their optimistic view of history, that is, that the saints are going to multiply exceedingly, and the saints will have an earthly victory and establish an earthly kingdom. And in that earthly kingdom, with the Christian Reconstructionists leading the way, no doubt, the church will physically punish and kill the ungodly rather than that the ungodly are persecuting the church. Because they thrust all of that into the past, I charge them with an inconsistent form of preterism, but also predict that if they keep on with that doctrine, they're going to end up in full-blown preterism. That's necessary because the very passages they appeal to, or the very passages that they explain as having been fulfilled in the past, are passages that prophesy the second coming of Christ. If those passages actually only refer to AD 70, Christ came in AD 70, and then he's not going to come again. So the logical implication of their view, and in theology as in all areas of knowledge, principles work through. The logic of their position demands, and their descendants and followers will develop it to that extent. There is no second coming of Jesus Christ to look forward to in the future.
Yes, the heresy of Hymenaeus and Philetus in 2 Timothy 2 of preterism is even called gangrene or cancer in it. It spreads.
That's right.
And then it kills. Yeah. Prof, I'm glad you brought up Matthew 24, because that passage receives full treatment in this book, some 4 chapters. You have 3 or 4 chapters on Isaiah 65 verses 17 and following, one of the glory passages. There's a lot of good exegesis in there. And I can comment on this as a reader. I greatly enjoyed those editorials when they came out. I remember getting the Standard Bearer and wanting to read those ones especially. And I've read this book several times. It's a book that stirs you up and puts heart in you because of its good, strong treatment of the subject. And I think in general too, even amillennial Christians, all of us need to think and become centered to really have our hope, not just in our words, but in our hearts. What am I looking forward to? The return of Jesus Christ. And I think that this book is well worth buying and reading. Christ's Spiritual Kingdom. Thank you.